Welcome back, everybody, to FieldLink, and my name's Bill Smith, and we're excited to have everybody join us today as we have a special report specifically on Beyond the Weather, and we're excited to introduce a couple folks from the Northern Ag Network as they talk about mental health and how it's impacting agriculture. Then we're going to follow up with Jody Lawrence, who's going to give us some further insight on some of the moving commodity markets. But folks, I want you to pay attention and watch your social media feeds as well as your podcast feeds, because Jody's going to rejoin us for a special global market update. We've got a world production report coming up very soon after this podcast. So keep an eye on that for that to hit. He's going to give us some deep insight on some of the production activities and some of the supply issues that we're faced with as it relates to global supplies and all of agriculture. So with that, welcome to FieldLink. Today, joining us on this episode of FieldLink is Courtney Kibblewhite and Amelia Soroki, both from the Northern Ag Network in Montana. Ladies, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks for having us, Bill. We appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Well, we're really excited to have you both join us here today. But before we talk about the subject at hand, let's learn a little bit more about the Northern Ag Network and both of you. Courtney, where's home?
Yeah, so I'm at home right now in Billings, Montana. And our network was started in 1975 by former Senator Conrad Burns, and this is our family business. So my dad joined in 1980. We're a Eastern Montana ranching family out in Sand Springs, Montana, and of course his dad told him you have to have a real job before you come back to the ranch, and he ended up working for Conrad at the network and never left. So we've been going since 1975 and started really as a network aimed at helping farmers and ranchers with price discovery and figuring out what livestock prices are. And now we serve farmers and ranchers across Montana, Wyoming, Western Dakotas with the information and optimism they need to survive and thrive.
That's awesome. And have you been in the radio business yourself for some time?
You know, I've been back to the family business 8 years. I was one of those girls who wants to discover the world before and ended up finding my way back home. But I lived in Chicago for school and worked in human capital and leadership consulting and in academia, and then found my way back to Montana. Came back about 2014. So I've been home 8 years and working with the family here.
Well, that's awesome, and it's always good to have good people in agriculture. Amelia, how about yourself? Tell us about your journey.
Yeah, so my husband and I live just west of Billings, but my family ranches in very rural central Montana. I always joke that Courtney's family is like neighbors with us. Even though it's 100 miles in Montana terms, she is my neighbor. So my family ranches.
Neighbors, that counts.
My family ranches in rural central Montana. So grew up around agriculture, was really involved in 4-H and FFA. Went to college for ag business, lived in Wyoming for a brief period of time, and then moved back to Montana with my husband and have been at Northern Ag Network coming up on 6 years.
So Amelia, let's talk a little bit about agriculture. Those of us that are in agriculture, we have this stigmatism for being, this tough, get it done kind of a crowd, suck it up, buttercup, pull up your bootstraps kind of identity. And that's truly our identity and has been for centuries in most cases. But that's not always the case when it comes to mental health. Help us better understand our true identity.
Well, I think what can be challenging is I'll give the example of my family. You have these stories of my great-grandfather came up from Texas when he was 16 to work on a ranch until he owned it. And my grandfather almost lost the ranch in the 80s, and we almost didn't get passed on to our generation that my brother now runs it. And so it's such a weight of responsibility. And you think about, okay, well, if I'm not profitable this year, and all my identity is wrapped up in the ranch, does that mean that I'm a bad person? That I'm not worth anything? That I shouldn't be here? you can see this horrible train of thoughts that can happen just from that concept of your entire identity being wrapped up in your occupation and in the land. So I think that can be part of the challenge for people in agriculture, is to think about, no, you're more than the land, and you're more than than your family, and really reframing for yourself. And it oftentimes takes somebody on the outside to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's kind of that theme of, all of us in agriculture are really good of, if something's broken, let's fix it. And Amelia, I think you had a pretty interesting story about tractors, how, if they're broken, you got to fix them.
So we had a producer tell us the story about, if you went outside and you're working on your tractor every day, it's just like yourself. You're working on it every day, right? And one day it breaks down. You're not going to limp that tractor through the entire harvest, through that entire season, if it's got a flat tire, if the engine's not running right, even if it's just what seems like one small aspect, but it's really impacting the performance of that tractor, you're going to fix it right away. You're not going to let it run that whole season on diminished performance. And he made the comparison that mental health is just that. It might seem like, oh, it's just my sleep, I'm not getting as much sleep, but that's impacting your overall performance. It might seem like, oh, I just don't have time to do this, or, I don't really want to go do that anymore, and it was something I like to do. But that's impacting you as a whole, which is impacting your operation, it's impacting your profitability, it's impacting, your family, your loved ones, your neighbors. So even if it seems like it's just one small thing, it all fits into the bigger picture. So keeping yourself running right is just as comparable to keeping your tractor running right.
Yeah, and I think that's so relatable. And I think, putting it into those terms, I think most producers out there can really relate. We're not going to run that tractor with a dirty air filter, right? We're going to fix it. Once in a while, we need to clean out our air filter. And in this case, it might be reaching out to a mental health professional.
And I think the other thing that I would throw in there too, as we talk about the legacy and the identity of agriculture, is we need to consider how our words and the stories we tell right now and the analogies we use, how that affects our children. I think changing that we're too tough to need help approach is going to happen over generations, and we need to be teaching our kids that no, it's not that we're too tough to need help. We're smart enough to know when we need some help outside of our current resources, and teaching them that it's okay to talk about it by talking about it, some of the things that you may not be proud about. So learning from our experiences.
Recently, we were all in Kansas City for the National Farm Broadcasters Association conference, and both of you and your network were honored for an initiative that you have been working on, the Montana Mental Health Campaign that all of you worked on, did a phenomenal job, and you were honored with the Plambeck Award, which is an honor by the past president from the National Farm Broadcaster Association, president and Hall of Fame inductee, Herb Plambeck. And you were recognized for this single series of radio commercials and so forth by your peers. And that's a phenomenal honor. Have any of you ever received such an honor?
Yeah, this was a really exciting one to receive. It was a project that we've worked really hard on and put in a lot of time for, but I think overall it just was a really good platform for us to kind of promote the mental health initiative to a lot of other states and a lot of other farm broadcasters. After we received the award, I think 6 different states came up to me within an hour and asked how they could start something similar in their own state. So yes, it was great to receive it, and it felt amazing to be recognized, but it felt even more amazing that, we're impacting other states and kind of getting the conversation going there.
Well, the area that you touched was really, I'll call it ag sensitive, right? Because those of us that grew up in agriculture, tend to keep things to ourselves. I mean, I know my family sure has, my dad and my granddad and on and so on forth, and I'm sure most of your family has as well. But mental health is really kind of an important area in agriculture that's, now finally starting to be talked about. Tell us a little bit what inspired you guys to really, dive into this area.
I have to attribute it to something larger than us, really. It was kind of a perfect storm of getting involved with the, or we've, I guess, been involved for a long time with the Montana Department of Agriculture, but Amelia responded to an RFP that the Department of Agriculture had put out related to wanting to do some mental health work. And I know personally myself, I've struggled with depression since I was 15, and I've been that kid in my family that had the issues, if you will, and also had the shame of feeling like, gosh, you have to, all of your identity is wrapped up in what you do. All of your identity is wrapped up in how hard you work, and if you can't work as hard as or your mind's not in the right place, then you must be failing. That kind of perception. So when the perfect storm of events kind of unfolded, and then Amelia was the one who actually made that first move with the Montana Department of Agriculture. And you want to talk more about that, Amelia?
Yeah, so I saw it come across our state platform. They sent out kind of a press release talking about it. So I think we initially started talking to them about this program, I think almost exactly 2 years ago was the first time that they sent out, there was this COVID money that was out there, ARPA funds were out there. I think that was the first time I'd seen that there was actually going to be funding behind mental health and ag. I've seen a lot of other states or a lot of other organizations kind of try and start a little bit of a movement, but there hasn't ever really been much for funding behind it. And I think the funding part is really important because yes, word of mouth is great, but there's a lot of people that need reached. And so you need to have some, money behind it to create materials, to create a campaign, to build a website, all of those different aspects. Like I said, I think we started talking about it almost 2 years ago, pretty dang close, and have just been in touch ever since and really got in, from the ground up. So we worked with them on everything from creating the slogan to the logo to, what do the TV ads look like? What do the radio ads look like? How do we track it? How many people have we helped? We've tried to be there for them every step of the way. The Montana Department of Ag has put in a ton of work and allocated a ton of resources to this project. They have gone above and beyond for our state, and I really hope that other states will kind of see what they've done as a good outline of how they could do the same.
Well, that's an interesting perspective and a lot of insight shared around the campaign. Let's step back a little bit and before we dive into the campaign, but tell us a little bit about mental health. What's kind of the given situation from your perspective in agriculture? I think a lot of us kind of overlook the fact that there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of stress for farmers and ranchers out there, whether it be drought, whether it be dealing with commodity prices or crazy fuel prices or even land prices for that matter. Succession planning, it's all creates stress and some mental challenges. What are some insights that you could share with us from your perspective?
We had really, really good insight from a politician in Montana. We went to his farm and we were filming some content for the video. And I specifically remember this line that he said that was, there's always going to be another something. There's always going to be another drought. There's always going to be another change in the markets. There's always going to be another interest rate hike. There's always going to be something. It's about how you handle that something. And he brought up the mentality that in ag, it's all about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which I totally agree with. That was definitely how I was raised. That's how, my parents were raised, my grandparents were raised, was, you got to be tough to make it in this industry, which is so true. But being tough doesn't mean you can't also be vulnerable with your family or with, maybe a therapist. You have to be tough enough to still talk about it. And that was one area I felt like as a whole, everybody in ag kind of struggles with how do we stay tough without being, too open or telling people too many of our concerns or seeming like the weak link. I think there was a lot of that comparison going on where, so-and-so, my neighbor, they don't talk about it, so I shouldn't talk about it either. I don't want to seem like I'm the weak one on this road. So that was one area we saw a lot. That was a constant reminder that came up a lot was most people were just saying, you got to be tough, you got to be tough. Well, we get that, but we got to work past just the mentality of push through, everything's fine. Because someday it's not going to be fine, and it's about how you deal with that. There was a person who called into our network, actually. I think Courtney talked to them. So there's a really good story that goes around that.
Yeah, we had somebody call probably after a month. We started running radio ads about people. There's an opportunity for free counseling here in Montana, and someone called and said, I don't know why the Northern Egg Network is getting involved in this woke movement. Like, why are you guys getting all involved with that hippie stuff? And he said, my mom used to just say, oh, just buck up, Buttercup. And we said, well, we just don't want to see another one of our friends take their gun behind their barn and deal with things that way. We feel like we need to, as a group, become more vulnerable. And I'd second Amelia's comments about how tough we are. But I think the other element, and you look back, I love thinking about history and family history, and you look back at Amelia's family goes all the way back to Toussaint Charbonneau, the explorer in Montana, and when those people and a lot of our family members came out here, it was very male dominated. There wasn't a lot of women. The women came later, but there was also very little resources, and so you'd end up, at the end of the train line, perhaps find your 160 acre spread and try and make a go of it. And it's not only that you chose to be tough, but there just weren't resources. And even now in Montana and Wyoming and many rural places, there's not clinics necessarily. The county that our ranch is in is the size of Connecticut. There's 1,200 people. We're 45 miles from a grocery store in either direction. And there's certainly not a therapist in town. So, I think we all have these stories. That I'll share one of mine. I don't know if Amelia and Bill, you may have, this may spark stories in your family, but one of my ancestors, she's I think a great aunt, wrote this story called A Bride Goes West about moving from West Virginia to Montana to marry this cowboy in 1883. And she talks about how she had this lingering toothache her entire life. And finally, she just couldn't take it anymore, and they lived a couple hours wagon ride to the Indian, what are they called? Indian Affairs office. And so there was supposed to be a doctor there, but he wasn't there. So they looked around and found a pair of pliers, and somebody said, "Okay, I'll take out your tooth for you." Well, the guy jerked on her tooth, and it wouldn't come out, but he knocked out the filling on top of it. And so they just said, well, we'll call it good enough and go on there until, I don't know, it was a couple of years later that her husband was able to order some forceps from, back east. And that's how they dealt with toothaches. And she'd write about how, she wouldn't even kiss her kids because she was so embarrassed of the smell and, that feeling of, and that's just one example of healthcare that, it should be easier to talk about, our teeth. But for some reason, when you talk about what's going on inside, I'm sure she didn't talk a lot about how lonely it was to be the only woman, for miles, and those things that go on in our minds that are harder to paint a picture of. So I don't know. That's one of those stories that, and grandparents, they always passed it on to us about how tough the other generation was. But that's certainly something that I think about.
I think that's true for both men and women, certainly women in your scenario there, but even guys, gentlemen that I can remember, one of my first jobs was working in the seed industry in Nebraska, and there were some tough times, really tough times where hogs weren't worth anything, and we saw some of those market trends drop down, and really I had many customers take things so difficult because, that was their world, and it was crashing below them, and they couldn't control it, and they didn't know how to handle their emotions. They would take them out either on family or friends or even themselves, unfortunately, from time to time. So mental awareness in agriculture, and Courtney, as you mentioned, finding therapists and just medical health as a whole in rural America is a little bit of a challenge in some places. So tell us a little bit, Amelia, how your initiative really captured, I guess, some minds and hearts of folks in Montana.
Yeah, so what we ended up calling the project was Beyond the Weather. Keeping in mind that the first thing we talk about with everybody is the weather. I mean, even today, as soon as we got on, the first thing I told Bill was it was negative 30 here 2 days ago. So the first thing everybody in ag talks about is the weather. Is there a storm coming? Is it hot? Is it cold? But it's not very often that we get beyond the weather with our neighbors or our friends to ask them how they're doing, how they're really doing. So that's kind of the, I guess, encompassing theme beyond the campaign. The campaign has multiple parts to it. So part of it is erasing the stigma and just creating the public awareness, which we do with, radio ads and TV ads and some digital components. But a really big part of this initiative is the free counseling access for Montana Ag. It includes up to 6 sessions, and the really big things for me, and I guess for my family, is it's telehealth. You can do it from anywhere. I know one of my friends did it in the tractor cab while she was feeding calves. So you can do it from anywhere. It's telehealth, and it's anonymous. Being from these small little, rural towns, it'd be embarrassing, if somebody saw your car in front of the only therapist in town. They're probably going to say something to you. So having that, telehealth and be anonymous, I think that's been one of the reasons it's been really successful in the number of people we've helped. Just because they don't have to have that fear of, the public finding out or, having that conversation when maybe they're not ready to yet. One of the other really great aspects of this was that some of the funding went to bring in mental health speakers at conventions and for different organizations. So I think for the last, I want to say about 14 months or so, every ag convention we've had in the state of Montana has had some form of mental health speaker, which never happened before. We go to a ton of conventions, we try and hit them all, and I can tell you these conventions where there is a mental health speaker, it at least gets people thinking about it and gets the conversation going. Whether or not that person's ready to hear it right now, they might not be, but maybe the person next to them is and has been having a hard time for months and hasn't known the right way to deal with it, or, isn't quite ready to take the first step, but hearing that somebody else is struggling gets them there. So having the speakers be involved in that, ag space in the convention arena has been huge. And it's really opened up a lot of conversations. We've had people come up to us afterwards and talk about their own experience, maybe using the free counseling access, or what the clicking point was for them when they thought, okay, I need help, or, I'm not sleeping. I didn't think about that as a sign of depression. I'm not really eating, I'm not finding joy in these things. There's all these things that people might not connect with mental health and depression that are absolutely signs and symptoms. So just getting them to recognize that through those speakers has also been awesome.
Amelia, the campaign that you worked on, tell us where do people go to learn more about some of these initiatives?
Yeah. So every state has their own kind of funding. For Montana, it's just beyondtheweather.com. Really easy, really simple. You can also go to northernag.net, and there's a Beyond the Weather tab where you can see some of the videos we've put together. You can see articles that have been written, op-ed pieces that have been done. There's all those different places, but I know every state kind of has their own agenda. Some of them haven't quite worked through, maybe what their campaign is specifically in their state. But every Department of Ag should have, if you reach out to your own Department of Ag, they should be able to put you in contact with the person in charge.
And I think that's important. Not all states have, got to the point where you're all at right now, but nonetheless, you can still access that information and learn about, mental health, maybe some of the challenges that you might be facing, and really, kind of do some self-investigation and find out if you do need to seek out some professional help.
Well, and I think a large part of the movement is just normalizing the conversation, that we all have this internal tape running, and sometimes, sometimes it can be super negative and sometimes it can be super positive, and it in ways it can be really different if you're outside. In our family, I'm feeding cows every day, fixing equipment so you can feed the cows. That's what you're doing all day, every day. So if a doctor says, oh, well, you need to get more exercise, you're thinking shoot, I'm outside exercising all the time. What do you mean? But there might be specific little ideas that somebody, and it doesn't even, we don't all need to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I think the other part about our Western or rural culture, and at least in the West, is it's better to be humble and it's better to say less. Do more, say less. And what that can cause is is somebody just bearing those feelings, bearing those emotions. I tease my brother when I go out to the ranch because I feel like I never know what the plan is, and I don't. How does the hired man know that we're going to do this and that? And where does all this communication happen? Because I was at the breakfast table too, and I didn't understand any of it, and so many of us or maybe it's just the family communication within your own family, but talking about things. Even the weather, just to get beyond it too, how does it feel that you haven't been able to get off the ranch in 6 months because you haven't had anybody to help? That would be another advice a therapist might give you. Oh, maybe you need to take a vacation or relax. Well,
Sure.
well, who's going to feed your cows? Or those little things. So yeah, I think that just the aspect of bringing this up in conversations and being a leader, I think vulnerability is something that isn't common in our industry, and you can be a leader just by being willing to say, gosh, when somebody says, how are you doing? You don't have to just say, yeah, good, how are you? You can say, I lost 2 of my grandmothers this year. It's kind of been a tough year. And you can be honest about that. And when you're honest, it gives somebody else the space to be vulnerable as well. And you just don't know. We did, the Montana Agri-Trade Exposition happens every February, and we tested that Beyond the Weather and a few other campaign slogans. I guess kind of an unofficial test. We had, what was it, Amelia, 4 different slogans and logos, and we were asking folks to vote with a poker chip on which one they identified. And even just by having that little sign up in our booth of, vote for the logo you like, people came up to us and had all these stories and shared really personal, vulnerable things. We've had more people just say thank you for bringing up the conversation. So it's interesting to see how if you open yourself to it, it can really take hold.
Yeah, and I think, I keep coming back to, us in agriculture, we're growing up to be the tough guys, so to speak, or tough gals that pull up your bootstraps. You mentioned it, Amelia. I mean, that's how we were raised. And with technology today, to your point is so real. I mean, I grew up in a small town, very small town, and boy, you knew where everybody was at. You parked the truck in front of the post office or the pub or whatever it is, you knew they were in there. To do that in front of a doctor's office of some kind, it could be really, I guess, troubling for some folks. It shouldn't be, but it is. But now with technology to do some of these things that you mentioned, with remote health, you can access things. Internet, my goodness, you can pretty much access the internet in most places today, and we can find that kind of help if we need it. Amelia, tell us a little bit about some of the success stories that you've had. You've ran this campaign for almost a year now. What are some success stories that you can share with our audience?
Yeah, so on the free counseling access, we've helped almost 40 producers in Montana, which might not seem like a ton, but the way that I think about it is if we've helped 40 people, there's 40 people who have actually reached out and gotten free counseling. Think about all the other people who maybe aren't at that point where they need free counseling, but this at least got the discussion going in their family. So I feel really happy that we've been able to help so many of those people, but just some of the, like Courtney mentioned, the stories and the personal things that people have shared with us. We had a farmer in southern Montana. He was telling us, it doesn't have to be some big event. One of the misconceptions he always sees about mental health is, someone has to die. There has to be a divorce. You have to lose the farm. There has to be some big event. And he just said, that's not how it is. It could be, everything is compounding. Your interest rate went up this year. You lost your ag banker. It could be a few what might seem small things, but they all happen at once. And, with all of that, you just feel this stress and this immense pressure. But one of the things that he mentioned is that, he has actively went to counseling before. He's not he's not shy to share about it. He tells people about it. But he says he's not a fan of going long term. He went a few times, but the thing that he got out of it was he got tools that he could use on the farm himself to kind of recenter himself when he's having a rough day or when something, really drastic happens. He has the tools to be able to deal with it himself, which I thought was super powerful because, farmers and ranchers probably don't want to keep going to counseling every single week, for years on end. But if they can even just go a few times and learn some of those resources or ways to deal with things, that'll set them up for long-term success. It's all about that, teach a man to fish, that same story.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point. I think Courtney mentioned it earlier. It isn't reaching out to these hotlines and utilizing some of these resources doesn't mean you're immediately going to be, sitting on a couch with a therapist once or twice a week. And, it could be some simple things like, hey, you got a lot going on in your life, just listening and having somebody to talk to. It might be as simple as, hey, you need to get out and go for a walk for you once a day or something like that, or learn to, breathe a little bit differently. I mean, there could be tons of solutions for everybody's, challenges that they may have, but it's not all cookie cutter when it comes to mental health. Tell us a little bit about the website that you worked on, Amelia. You mentioned you've assisted 40 folks at this point, but tell us about some of the access that people have been reaching out, utilizing some of those tools.
Yeah. So on that website, we've tried to make it really easy and really simple for people. There's a form they can fill out right on the website to get connected with a therapist really quickly. There's a third party that administers the, actual therapy services. And I think they say that they'll reach out within 24 hours. So really quick turnaround time to get you connected with somebody. There's also, like, if you are with one of those organizations and you want to have a mental health speaker, there's kind of information about getting one of those mini grants on there. There's videos that we've done, like I mentioned, and then there's also a resources section that just connects you with the WARSAP, Western Agri-Stress. I'm butchering the acronym, but
it's like Western Regional Agri-Stress, yeah.
So it connects you with WARSAP, which is just basically services in this region that may be helpful to you. So there's information. One of the things that's also on there is there's some information about substance use that I think is really helpful. I know personally, like in my family, the way that my family's always dealt with things is drinking. Well, that's not a healthy way to deal with things, and it's not sustainable long term. And I think that's one connection that they've been able to make, is that there are a lot of producers who do turn to substances, whether it's alcohol or tobacco or, whatever it may be. So there's information about that as well.
Awesome. And I think it's important for our listeners, whether you're, so you all are certainly in Montana and you've got that state covered, but reach out to a lot of these resources, your departments of agriculture, every state's got some different resources out there, but the important thing is to reach out if you're struggling. That's really the issue here. Take advantage of the many resources that are out there and just talk to somebody.
I think that can be the challenge sometimes, is it's hard when it's hard to make a decision to even get out of bed. It can be hard to decide who do you call, even if you can acknowledge there's something wrong. But that first step, like you said, tell somebody that cares. And I think that is one great thing about Beyond the Weather is it has given people that here's the therapist you go to, just start here. And I think, for any family members and even folks who are serving the agriculture community, whether you're selling chemical or seed or feed or, you're financing, people need to, people, when they know you care, they'll be willing to open up. And sometimes just having a little bit of separation between the person, but some trust relationship, you can really be in a position to help somebody. If you notice, one thing somebody told me is if you go to a farmer's place and his equipment is usually just immaculate and put away and everything's ship-shape, and the next time you go, things are kind of left out, he's maybe not showering, not taking care of himself, those can all be signs that something else is going on here. And rather than just staying and talking about the weather, get beyond it and don't be afraid to ask, hey, what's going on in your mind? Because people are usually relieved to hear somebody bring that up versus, defensive.
I think that's a really good point. And all of us that are involved in agriculture, those of us that are in sales are working, with growers on a day-to-day basis. I think it is important to take a deep breath and maybe recognize some of those things that you just pointed out, Courtney, and ask those vulnerable questions. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do, and be a listener. An active listener is a great trait for any person that's involved in not just sales, but heck, if you're a neighbor, it's okay to ask those kind of questions.
And making the point to ask it in person too.
And a lot of times people, when somebody says, "Oh, I'm not, I'm struggling with this, or I'm not doing great," it's hard to know how to respond to that as the person hearing it. So one phrase that we've heard come up over and over is just saying, "Tell me more about that." okay, you're really struggling with, hay prices right now. Tell me more about that and how it's, impacting you or how it's affecting you. On average, you have to ask somebody 3 times before they'll kind of get to this point. So you need to be comfortable enough with them to ask them, how are you doing? No, how are you doing? No, how are you really doing? You have to be a little bit persistent and be able to ask it in the right frame of mind, where once they tell you, here's what's going on, you need to be ready to hear that and, be ready to listen. Like you said, be an active listener, participate in the conversation, and do it without judgment.
I want to thank Amelia Soroki as well as Courtney Kibble-White from the Northern Ag Network in Montana for joining us today here on FieldLink to share this very important topic around agriculture as it relates to mental health.
Thank you so much for having us, Bill. We really appreciate it.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
And we're welcoming Jody Lawrence back to FieldLink. Jody, the markets continue to get a little crazy right now. What's going on in the marketplace at this time?
Well, Happy New Year, Bill, and Happy New Year to everybody that's listening. First podcast of 2023, and the general set of facts have not changed much over the holidays, the long holiday weekends that we had, because you still have the war raging in Ukraine, and now Ukraine has taken the offensive into Russia on a couple different times, and you got the price of crude oil back down in this low $70 area, and diesel trading $2.90 on the futures, $2.90, $2.95. And the biggest thing really that we're looking for coming up this week is Thursday. The USDA puts out its final 2022 crop report. They'll update yield, they'll update planted acres, they'll update exports, they'll update supply and demand across the world. So it's a really, really big report that always moves the market, because the USDA and WASDE, their world counterpart, comes in and updates every column that they have on their balance sheets. So you've got a lot of moving parts come Thursday, and that comes out at 11 o'clock Central.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to having that report come out Thursday. And Jody, we're going to have a special edition episode. This will be our World Production Report special. Jody's going to join us for a special podcast that'll be aired and launched shortly after that particular report comes out. So I encourage our listeners to listen into all of the content and all the details as he breaks it down. Line by line, like you mentioned, everything from wheat production to cotton production, on and on. It's going to have it all kind of covered there. So be sure to listen in to their next podcast, that special edition podcast featuring Jody. So Jody, as far as the markets right now, we're seeing some activity globally as it relates to weather, having some impact certainly on the soybean markets in South America, both Brazil and Argentina, picking up some rain and moisture. How are the markets reacting to that news recently?
Everything is revolving around Argentina right now, because they are still stuck in a really, really dry, their 100-year drought is how they're referencing it. And what it has done is, since Argentina is a huge exporter of bean meal, they process it out to bean meal. Bean meal is making new contract highs over the last several trading sessions, which has supported the entire soybean and bean oil markets with it. And obviously, if beans are high, it helps support corn as we make critical planting decisions in the northern hemisphere going into the spring. So you've really got a stubborn transition. You have had some rain lately, and you've had some hints that by the end of the month, the transition to a wetter, more seasonal forecast is coming for Argentina. But I think everybody has gotten to a point with predicting the weather, especially La Nina and El Nino this year, how they're interacting is they're going to wait till they see water in the rain gauge before they break the market. But if Argentina's bean crop, is saved by some timely rains in late January and February, we do have some concern for the downside of the market.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, Argentina as well as Brazil, some other leading trading partners being China right now. And, with the COVID scare up and down and ever changing in China, how is that potentially going to impact some of the demand for soybeans?
Well, China really over the holidays made a 180 change from their very hardline zero COVID policy where they had cities of millions of people on lockdown if they hit a very low threshold of 50 or 100 positive tests that day. And they came to the conclusion that their economy was suffering so much that they were going to have to take on a much more Western approach of vaccines and letting a herd mentality, or not a herd mentality, but a herd immunity be developed. And they have a high infection rate right now, which was expected, but they are pumping in billions of dollars in stimulus, just like the U.S. was doing in the early days of COVID. And with some policy change, and if the measures they're taking work and China's economy does rebound quicker than was originally expected, some of the really dire talk of world recession in 2023 could be softened a little bit. So we're optimistic that they'll be able, that they're heading in the right direction, but not 100% convinced that we're about to start another bull run simply because of their demand prospects.
Wow. An ever-changing story, certainly in China, and the global impact on that for farmers in the U.S. is really crazy and changing every day with those kind of policies. Jody, you referenced some energy earlier. What seems to be happening right there in the energy market right now as we're taking a look at diesel prices?
Well, a couple different things. You've got diesel on futures trading down around 290 again. You've got crude in this buy area for replenishing the U.S. strategic reserve in the $70 to $73 a barrel. And you also, because of the warm weather that has occurred over the northern hemisphere, it started in Europe, and after our Christmas freeze, the U.S. has really been in a very mild, as has Europe, pattern, and natural gas has fallen to multi-year lows, and that has helped on several different factors, because I've been talking with the guys in the fertilizer side of the business. We are seeing all of the nitrogen-based products and a lot of the inputs that natural gas is a big component of begin to soften and come down, which is good news heading into prepay. And then also natural gas on farm, when you talk about drying your corn and being able to hedge what your costs are going to be for the fall to get, because natural gas has dropped 50% in value, that you certainly have some areas on the fuel side where you can make some hedges to help your long-term outlook and know what your energy costs are going to be for the spring and summer.
Yeah, definitely. I just crossed the kind of relating back to a couple podcasts ago. We talked about the drought and, the Mississippi River, how dry it was, impacting a lot of the energy as well as fertilizer prices. I just crossed the river today, Jody, and I saw several barges in the Memphis area going up and down. So that river has certainly been recharged with recent rains over the last 3 weeks or so. So hopefully that's going to impact that fertilizer market as well.
Yeah, it's starting. Things are starting to come online, because you certainly you want the rivers you need the rivers full to get back to normal logistics, and it's a good thing for everybody involved in the ag industry for transportation to be normal.
All right, Jody, I want to thank you. I know you're on the road this week. You're calling in today from, I believe, Florida. Is that correct?
Yes, Florida for one sales meeting, on the way to Illinois for another one for Helena. Happy to cover all of the topography for them, because this is a busy time of the year for all the meetings.
Yep. 'Tis the season for meetings. We certainly have several coming up across the country, trade shows, and we encourage growers to stop in and see us at many of these trade shows. We've got the Mid-South Gin Show coming up here in a few weeks, and the Commodity Classics just a few months away. So we're looking forward to seeing everybody at those shows here coming very soon. Jody, thanks for joining us today here on FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill.
Hey, everybody, I want to thank you all for joining us on this special edition of FieldLink. It was great to have both Courtney and Amelia join us talking about Beyond the Weather and how mental health impacts agriculture. I also want to encourage everybody to be watching your podcast feeds, and be sure to look for the next podcast as we talk about the World Production Report. Jody Lawrence is going to join us and have a very focused podcast on global supply right now, some of the things that we're seeing from the USDA. So be sure to join us for our next FieldLink podcast.